Welcome back to the channel, everybody. This is part 2 of the Caterpillar 10 clutch bearing replacement project. In this video I'm going to get the new throwout bearing installed into the yoke, get the yoke assembled to the pressure plate, and I'm going to perform a couple of other repairs in the bell housing area of that tractor as long as I have it opened up and everything is accessible. So let's get started. First step is to get the new throwout bearing placed into the yoke, and you have to be sure to get this positioned in correctly. This is a thrust bearing, and it is only capable of absorbing side thrust in one direction only. So this definitely has to be placed in the right orientation. And to get this seated down into the yoke, I'm going to use the old rough bearing sort of as a driver, and I'm going to position this in the press in a manner which is going to allow this outer race of the old bearing to align with the outer race of the new bearing, and press that new bearing in and get it all down and seated where it needs to be. Over here at the press, before I place the new bearing in the yoke, one last thing I want to mention. Since I'm using the old bearing to press the new bearing in, I slightly reduced the outside diameter of the outer race so that it is no longer a press fit in the yoke and can pass down in without getting stuck. Since that yoke bore is a little bit deeper than either race on the new bearing or the old, I didn't want the old bearing to stick in the top after I had seated the new one down in the bottom. So the new bearing goes in the yoke, being sure to have it positioned the correct way. Old bearing goes on top of that, and my press block to ensure the force is transmitted through the outer races only and not through any of the ball bearings. Now that the new bearing is fully seated in the yoke, the next step is to get it all assembled to the pressure plate. And I've got the plate cleaned up, and I've also inspected this center bushing to ensure that it's still a proper fit on the input shaft. If this bushing was excessively worn, this is the point in time in which I would be replacing it. But since we're good, I'm going to fixture this in the press also and get the new bearing pressed onto the hub. One thing to note, this center hub is a separate piece from the rest of the pressure plate, so instead of putting all of the press force down through the plate, instead I'm going to support this right at the back side of the hub itself. That's going to prevent this hub from moving around inside the pressure plate. It's also going to protect the pressure plate, and it's going to keep all the tension isolated right to the hub and the shoulder instead of having to go down through the plate and risk any kind of damage to anything else. So here I've got my support placed up inside the pressure plate, bearing directly on the back side of that hub, like I said I was going to do. The new bearing and yoke is loosely positioned on the top of the hub. I'm going to take this steel sleeve and disc to place on top of the inner race of the bearing. That way I'm going to only be applying pressure to that inner race, and it's not going to have to work through the bearing. Now that the bearing is fully seated on the hub, it's time to talk about installing the fold-over lock and the retention nut. Since the tab on the original fold-over lock is becoming quite fatigued where it bends, I was able to source a new lock, and I also was able to get a new old stock retention nut. This old one has been buggered from people using a hammer and a punch on it in the past, so I got one that's in brand new condition. One thing you'll notice about this new fold-over lock, there are 2 external tabs on it where the original one only had 1, and I do like this a little bit better because I've already test fit this under the new nut, and I've determined that this tab will align perfectly with one of my notches, and this tab is not needed. Since there's not room to have them both on there, you just remove the one you don't need, so that's why this one's colored with a marker. I'm going to get this taken off and then we'll start installing these pieces. Okay, I've removed the surplus tab, so I'll just place the lock on top of the bearing, start the new nut, and I will securely tighten it down while aligning that remaining tab with one of the notches. Now that the nut is tight, I'll finish folding in the tab and make the installation permanent. Now to fit the washer, and I will roll the snap ring in place. This assembly is now complete and ready for installation. However, before I can do that, there are a few other things I'm going to look at in the bell housing area of that cat, as long as they are still open and accessible. So since I'm passing by the engine anyhow, on my way out to the chassis, here's one of the pieces that I wanted to take a good look at as long as I was this far into the machine. It's the pilot bearing and the flywheel. When you're this far into a tractor, you definitely want to really take a good look at this, and if there was any kind of damage or wear to this piece, this is definitely the time to be replacing it. In my case, this seems to be in very good condition yet. Probably all I'm going to have to do is just make sure that's clean, get some fresh grease in it, and that should be good to go. Back out here at the chassis now, having a look inside the bell housing. There are a few things I want to address in here. First being, my clutch fork is getting a bit worn where it pulls out on the release bearing yoke. So I have this fork here that's in much better condition. I'll likely end up putting that in as long as I'm in here. Second thing I want to look at is the clutch brake. I want to get this cleaned up and get it working a little bit better. And the third thing is I want to get this cover off the input shaft and have a look at that seal back there. This area was quite oily before I performed the initial cleaning on it, so I want to see if I can maybe find a modern equivalent seal to go in under this cover and maybe seal that shaft up a little better. So the first step is to unbolt the clutch brake collar, and the parts manual says there should be 2 bolts holding it to the shaft. I got one here, and I suspect the other one should have been right here, but I only had the one, so that's something I'm going to have to make right. So I'll get the bolt out. And for now, just slide the collar back on the input shaft out of my way. Next, I need to get the clutch fork out of the way. So I'll remove the pinch bolt and nut from each side of the fork. Now to withdraw the shafts from the fork, I have a chisel wedged in the back side in the open slot to facilitate removal. It just kind of takes the bind off of the shaft a bit, but don't go crazy with this. These parts are old and you really don't want to break anything. But that does help those shafts come out quite a bit easier. And now both shafts can be removed for cleaning. Now to get the input shaft nut loose, you'll have to pound back the lock tab. And I got the nut loose. This is 1 11/16" nut, kind of odd size, but nut will come off. And we'll draw the tab too. This one's a little bit buggered where it's been mashed over by the nut, but have to get a new one of those. At this point, the clutch brake flange can be removed. And after removing the 4 nuts, the input shaft seal retainer can be taken out. Back in the shop now on the bench, I've got the input shaft seal retainer in here. I've cleaned it up a bit, and I took the 2 halves apart, and inside found the original Caterpillar T-294 input shaft seal. This is a 1-piece felt ring seal, and this one's worn on the inside diameter. It no longer fits the input shaft very well, and it's hard as a rock. And my trouble that I'm having with this is I have not been able to find any replacement T-294 seals. I've tried all the new old stock sources. I've tried to cross the part number. Really have not been able to come up with anything at all. So after checking the dimensions and doing a search, I found this seal. It's a SKF 16871. It matches my critical dimensions about as close as I could possibly ask for as far as shaft size and bore diameter. And I'm going to conduct a little experiment here and see if I can't make this one work. I'm going to have to modify it pretty heavily to go within the space constraints that I have in here. But I'd like to be able to get this modern style rubber lip seal to work in these two old original housings, and just see if I can get something that's going to be a little bit better than this old worn out felt seal. So if you'll bear with me and stick it out, we'll see what we can make happen here. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to have to do is decrease the overall width of the seal, and since I don't have room for this outer flange anyway with the pieces that I'm going to be putting it in, I'm just going to cut that portion off. The seal is currently a 1/2 inch wide. I need to take it down to 0.300, so I'm going to cut 2/10 of an inch of width off. I don't know if you can see it, but I have a faint pencil line around here where the cut is going to be. So let's have at it. So the work on the lathe went pretty well. I got rid of the flange, and I'm left with the portion of the seal that I really wanted. And now it should be thin enough that it will fit between these two pieces and not cause any interference problems. So now I need to get the seal positioned like this, pressed down into the outer retainer. So here's the finished piece. I got the lip seal driven in there, and I was really happy with how it fit. Even though this is just a stamped steel housing, it seemed like it went in really nice and it fits well in that bore. And like I said, because it's a stamped steel housing, right before I pressed the seal in, I backed it up with a little bit of Permatex sealer around the outside diameter, just in case there was any surface irregularities that would need to fill. But looking back in hindsight, I really don't think I really needed to, as nicely as it drove in. But so that is what I would consider to be a workable solution around having obsolete parts and not being able to get factory original components. I'm not saying this is the solution to the input shaft seal problem, but I think it's definitely a solution. So if anybody can improve upon this in any way or has any ideas how a guy could do this a little bit better, hey, feel free to share it in the comments. So I got most everything cleaned up that's going to go back in the bell housing. Everything's pretty much ready to go. I got a new gasket to go underneath the front bearing plate, and of course the new seal in the outer cover, and I got a little bit thicker gasket to go between the outer cover and the bearing plate, again just to kind of take up any irregularities between that stamped tin cover and that cast iron back piece. So let's start getting all these things put back in the chassis. First thing to do then is position the new gasket and the bearing plate all the way back here onto the 4 studs. And now the input shaft seal cover and the gasket for it. And with all 4 fasteners tight, give it a quick spin, check the shaft. No binding, no excessive drag, all feels good. It is now time to loosely position the clutch brake flange on the input shaft, and I'm not even going to start any of the bolts into this because its final position can only be set after the engine is installed. And now comes the input shaft nut and a new fold-over lock to go under it. One quick thing to note, the tab on the inside of the lock has to be folded up to clear this threaded area of the input shaft so that it can get into the recessed keyway that's cut in the shaft back behind it. Once the lock is clear of those threads, you can take a little punch, get it bent down into that key slot, and you're ready to put the nut on. And once you've got the nut tight, just pick a portion of the lock that's over one of the flats and fold it over as tightly as you can. I'm working through the top bell housing opening with a long punch, small hammer, just trying to ensure I've got the tightest bend possible onto the flat of the nut. And you can't see it out here, but I have my knee under the end of the input shaft, kind of supporting it while I'm striking it, so all that force isn't just going down into the shaft. One last thing to note, it worked pretty well for me to put the transmission in third gear and apply the brakes as hard as I could while I put my end wrench down through the opening in the top of the bell housing and got it on the nut. I did that to both loosen it and tighten it, and it seemed to work pretty well. Okay, bear with me here, guys. It's getting on evening now and the light's starting to get kind of bad, so I apologize for some of this glare that's coming in. But I'm going to get the clutch fork put in now. That's probably going to be the last part of this video. So I'll start with getting the shafts put in their bores, and I've lightly greased each one where they pivot in the housing, just so they're not dry. Now I'll put the fork in, and I'll just align the keys with the keyway slots. Everything should go together a little bit better than it came apart since it's all clean now. Okay, it ends up I did have to tap this one in a little bit, but they're both in where I want them right now. Just a quick point of reference, when I took these apart, each shaft was flush with the fork on each inside edge. So now the pinch bolts drop down from the top, and I'll get the nut and lock washer started on the bottom of each one, tighten both of these in, and make this assembly permanent. And there we go. Everything fits. Well, that finally does it for part 2. I got everything addressed inside the bell housing that had been bothering me, and I'm pretty much ready for final reassembly. So part 3 hopefully coming soon. I'll start out with getting the pressure plate with the new throwout bearing put back in. We'll get the engine bolted up, hook everything else up to it, perform all the necessary adjustments, and take it out for a little bit of a test drive, see how it all performs. So guys, as always, I thank you for watching. If you like what you're seeing, hit the button down below. Go ahead and subscribe to my channel. Always a good thing. And feel free to leave comments. I like reading through all that stuff too. So I'm going to put some tools away. In the meantime, hope to see you back for part 3.